Thank you, Olivia, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you as well to Reverend Sterling Freeman for the invitation and to Ms. Hill for arranging many of the details of the visit. I'm very excited to be back here for the second straight year. Last year, as part of the programming for the Unitarian Universalist House, I gave a broad lecture on the history of African American secularism. This year's talk, entitled Liberalism, Secularism, and Religious Freedom in African American Thought, is somewhat related, but I'll focus much more on African American religious liberals, with a specific focus on issues of religious freedom. We are at a moment where questions about the religious identity of this nation, specifically whether or not America is or should be a Christian nation, are at the forefront of national discourse. Historians of religion, such as myself, have written extensively on this topic, but not quite from the perspective I plan to explore. The overwhelming focus of scholarship on the history of religious freedom in the United States has been on white secular thinkers like Thomas Paine, Francis Wright, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others. Scholars of Black thought who have explored this topic, on the other hand, tend to focus on religious thinkers, such as Richard Allen, kind of traditionally religious thinkers. Richard Allen, founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Christopher Rush, founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or Mariah Stewart, what they had to say about religious freedom. Others have looked at how practitioners of African traditional religions and their offshoots, such as Santeria or Candomblé, have fought for religious freedom. Here I'll take a different approach and explore how Black secular thinkers and Black religious liberals conceived of religious freedom during the late 19th and 20th centuries. The four thinkers I'll explore in this talk are Frederick Douglass, Maria Baldwin, Ethelred Brown, and Louis McGee. Just a quick note on terms before I discuss Douglass. By secularism, I mean a commitment to promoting the public good through reason rather than faith. This does not mean that all proponents of secularism were personally irreligious, although that's often the case, but it does mean that their religious sensibilities, if they had them, were not the guiding force in their political activism and social thought. And they believe that public policy, more broadly, should be based on reason and science as opposed to the perspectives of any one particular faith. By liberalism, I'm referring not to political liberalism, but rather to the religious tradition that emerged in mid-18th century Boston and gained strength throughout the 19th century, especially among the Unitarians. Religious liberals held a variety of beliefs, but some core values included biblical interpretations that relied on reason and science rather than faith, a rejection of miracles and doctrines such as the Trinity, and an embrace of perceptions of a loving deity that led many to argue that all human beings would be saved. Religious liberals, especially Unitarians, also emphasize self-culture, the idea that salvation lay not so much in what you believe, but in the ways that you improved yourself, whether that be physical, mental, moral, or spiritual. While few scholars have documented it, these ideas resonated strongly with a small cadre of Black intellectuals and would play important roles in Black cultural and political life during the 19th and 20th centuries. Perhaps the most towering Black intellectual of the 19th century was Frederick Douglass, who, along with his importance as an anti-slavery and women's rights activist, became an important religious thinker. Douglass's work on behalf of slaves, free African Americans, and women for freedom and equal rights often brought him into conflict with religion. And from his earliest writings, Douglass was one of the staunchest critics of American Christianity. The focus of his earliest critiques was the religion of the South. He noted in his first autobiography, his narrative in 1845, that religious masters are usually the worst ones. And I have a lengthy quotation that's really illustrative of both his and other enslaved people's views on American religion during the antebellum period. In August 1832, he writes, "My master attended a Methodist camp meeting held in the Bayside, Talbot County, and there experienced religion. I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and that if he did not do this, it would at any rate make him more kind and humane. I was disappointed in both these respects. It neither made him to be humane to his slaves nor to emancipate them. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in all his ways. For I believe him to have been a much worse man after his conversion than before. Prior to his conversion, he relied upon his own depravity to shield and sustain him in his savage barbarity. But after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slaveholding cruelty." Both times that Douglass attempted to open a Sabbath school to teach fellow enslaved people to read the Bible, he recalled, local whites broke it up. For Douglass, Christianity in the South was non-existent. Instead, they practiced a hypocritical religion that sanctioned cruelty and injustice. But the problem was not just Southern churches, but Northern ones as well. In his famous 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," he said, "The church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slave, it actually takes side with the oppressors. It has made itself the bulwark of American slavery and the shield of American slave hunters. Many of its most eloquent divines, who stand as the very lights of the church, has shamelessly given the sanction of religion and the Bible to the whole slave system." These eloquent divines included ministers such as Northern Unitarians, Ezra Stiles, Gannett, and Orville Dewey, both of whom preached, for instance, that people should obey man's law before God's and not resist statutes such as the Fugitive Slave Act. By not coming out in favor of abolition, ministers throughout the country, Douglass argued, committed a great sin of omission. "For my part," he noted, "I would say welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by those divines." Many Garrisonians, or followers of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, were so frustrated with the support that organized religion gave to slavery that they advised their followers not to attend church services. But Douglass goes even further in saying people should embrace atheism and religious unorthodoxy rather than support ministers who sanction slavery. Douglass's critique of American Christianity extended beyond white churches and into the post-Civil War era. Of African-American churches, he felt that most ministers' lack of education was troubling and that many black people would actually be better served in progressive white churches with a settled, educated minister. He also felt disdain for the emotionalism prevalent in black Christianity. But his biggest critique was that he felt black churches were too otherworldly. He despised any religious creed that said blacks should look to the next life for happiness rather than trying to achieve it now. Along similar lines, Douglass ran into conflict with black ministers in 1870 when, at the final meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, he remarked that while many people have thanked God for freeing the slaves, I like to thank men. I want to express my love to God and gratitude to God by thanking those faithful men and women who have devoted the great energies of their soul to the welfare of mankind. It is only through such men and such women that I can get a glimpse of God anywhere. The response by black religious leaders was to put forth a statement saying, "We will not acknowledge any man as a leader of our people who will not thank God for the deliverance and enfranchisement of our race, and will not vote to retain the Bible, the book of God, in our public schools." Douglass, who had also opposed efforts to send the Bible to enslaved people in the 1840s, replied to the statement, "I bow to no priests, either of faith or of unfaith. I claim as against all people simply perfect freedom of thought." Douglass expanded on these thoughts in an article that contained at times scathing views of the black church. He ridiculed the fact that AME Bishop Jabez Campbell and others had in effect put him on trial for heresy and dangerous sentiments. Trials for heresy used to be accompanied by torture and death, but now all they could do is harm someone's reputation, he noted. Nevertheless, if the church still had the power to inflict physical punishment, Douglass had no doubt that it would. For him, quote, "The condemnations, maledictions, and denunciations of the church, whether Bethel or St. Peter's, to the outside world have no more significance than the vulgar curses of the crowd." Douglass refused to acknowledge any special claim to morality by the church, which he argued should focus more on reforming the character of people in this world, again, rather than worrying about salvation in the next. He ended the piece by noting that charges of heresy by black religious leaders have no claim to any respect or deference from me or anybody else. Douglass would embrace the goals of the free thought movement during the late 19th century and participated in it to an extent. In a speech he delivered on Thanksgiving Day in 1870, Douglass claimed that he was glad to observe that the old superstitions respecting chance, luck, and providence were giving way to a more rational and scientific explanation of human success and failure. 4 years later, he was invited to speak at the annual convention of the Free Religious Association. This was an organization founded by Unitarian ministers in 1867 that was open to people of all faiths or none. The Free Religious Association was originally committed to scientific theism, or using the tools of science to prove theological propositions. But in 1872, the organization updated its position and noted that it did not endorse theism, a move meant to provide space for the growing number of agnostics and materialists in the late 19th century. The Constitution was further updated in 1885 to downplay pure religion, one of its original aims. The new language stated, "The objects of this association are to encourage the scientific study of religion and ethics, to advocate freedom in religion, to increase fellowship in the Spirit, and to emphasize the supremacy of practical morality in all the relations of life." For his part, Francis Ellingwood Abbott, one of the key drivers of the Free Religious Association, believed that free religion should be, quote, "free from the limitations of revealed religion, free from historical traditions, and free from ecclesiastical authorities." With this movement consisting of a diverse group of religious and irreligious thinkers, it was challenging to pin down a core set of beliefs, but two that most seemed to agree upon were the necessity of religious freedom, including the freedom not to believe in traditional notions of God, as well as the importance of being free from church structures and authorities. While Douglass was unable to speak at the event, his letter declining the offer to speak indicates that he agreed with the goals of the FRA. Freedom is a word of charming sound, he posited, not only to the tasked and tortured slaves who toil for an earthly master, but for those who would break the galling chains of darkness and superstition. Regarding the free religious movement as one for light, love, and liberty, limited only by reason and human welfare, and opposed to the works of those who convert life and death into enemies of human happiness, who people the invisible world with ghastly taskmasters, I give it hearty welcome. Douglass went on to become one of two vice presidents of the Free Religious Association in 1889. This position, along with his other writings and speeches, marked him as the preeminent black freethinker of his era. In addition to Frederick Douglass, Maria Baldwin emerged as a leading black participant in the Free Religious Association in the 1890s and the early 1900s. Baldwin is not as widely known as other black leaders of this time, yet she was a central figure in Boston's black freedom struggle in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1856 and graduated from Cambridge High School in 1874. 7 years later, she began a career as a teacher at the Agassiz Elementary School, a school comprised of the children of Cambridge's academic and professional elite. The same year that Douglass became a vice president of the FRA, 1889, also saw Baldwin promoted to principal of the Agassiz Elementary School, a position that marked her as the most prestigious black educator in New England. Little is known about Baldwin's religious upbringing, but by the 1890s, she had embraced religious liberalism. Baldwin noted that she was brought up in a faith, but it's unclear exactly what that faith was. When she was born, there are no black churches in Cambridge proper, so her parents might have belonged to one of the black churches in Boston before two were created in Cambridge. In 1890, church membership was relatively low among black Bostonians, with only 16% of African Americans in Massachusetts claiming membership in a church that year, compared to, say, 52% of blacks in North Carolina. During the 1890s, Baldwin worshiped at Hope Congregational Church, but she also became a member of the Boston Society for Ethical Culture and served one term as the chapter president. Ethical culture was a movement very similar to free religion that Felix Adler had started in New York City in 1876, largely as a way to combat poverty. Membership in ethical culture societies was open to everyone, and for most members, morality was more important than theology. Adler had actually been president of the Free Religious Association from 1879 to 82, but resigned to focus on leading the Society for Ethical Culture. So it's no surprise that Maria Baldwin would move seamlessly between these two organizations in Boston. By 1895, she had become a member of the Free Religious Association, which at that time was headed by the old transcendentalist and abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson. In the Free Religious Association, Maria Baldwin found an outlet for her activist sensibilities and a supportive intellectual community. In June of 1900, she gave a speech before an FRA meeting in Boston and stated that she left the faith she was brought up in because she found that a good life counted for nothing unless it is allied to belief in a creed or belief in a social justice cause larger than oneself. During the period of her involvement with the FRA, the organization was vocal in support of women's suffrage and in opposition to American imperialism in the Philippines and elsewhere. Curiously enough, the FRA did not take stances on racial issues, and Baldwin's biographer, Kathleen Weiler, notes that part of her role was actually to educate white members of the FRA about issues of race, as there were no other prominent black members in the organization after Frederick Douglass passed away in 1895. She performed this educational function, an extension of her day job, at both regular meetings of the FRA and at the association's annual conference in 1904, where she gave a speech entitled "The Duties and Rights of Different Races in the Republic." While the organization itself did not take stances on racial issues, it did provide Baldwin and other black activists and intellectuals with space in which to discuss these issues. In addition to Baldwin's speech at the 1904 annual meeting, for example, the 34th annual meeting of the FRA held in Boston in 1901 featured an interracial and interfaith panel discussion on the ethics of race relationship that included speakers such as the Chilean Catholic Carolina Hidobro, Rabbi Charles Fleischer, and T. Thomas Fortune, editor of the nation's leading black newspaper, The New York Age. This type of community fostered in the Free Religious Association appealed to Maria Baldwin's own intellectual and activist interests. In addition to her role educating white liberals about racial issues, Baldwin emerged as a leading black activist in Boston herself. In the 1890s, she established a literary gathering for black students at Harvard, holding salons at her house with emerging black thinkers such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Clement Morgan, and William Monroe Trotter, future editor of the Boston Guardian. In February 1893, she joined Flora Ridley and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin to form the Women's Era Club in Boston, which grew from their interest in anti-lynching, but quickly expanded to include all issues facing black women. The Women's Era Club became a centerpiece in the broader club movement organized by African-American women throughout the nation. The first public action that Baldwin took as part of the club was the publication of a Columbian Year Contrast that showed the stark disparity between the freedom and progress highlighted at the 1893 Columbian Exposition with the reality of lynching in the United States. Baldwin then participated in meetings in 1895 that led to the formation of the National Association of Colored Women, which would be the leading Black women's political organization in the United States. In the early 20th century, Baldwin expanded her efforts and became one of 6 African Americans on the Negro National Committee that first met at the Liberal Club in New York City in November 1909. As part of this effort, she helped to organize a conference in May of 1910 that established the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. A branch of the NAACP was organized in Boston in 1912, and Baldwin served on its executive committee from 1912 to 1915, marking her as one of Boston's and the nation's most important Black activists. Another important Black voice on matters of religious freedom was Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown. Born in Falmouth, Jamaica in 1875, Brown's early religious exposure was deeply rooted in the Anglican and Wesleyan Methodist traditions. His spiritual transformation began on an Easter Sunday when he participated in the recitation of the Athanasian Creed at an Episcopalian church in Jamaica. As the congregation affirmed, the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Ghost is God, and yet these are not 3 gods, but one God, Brown experienced a profound moment of theological doubt. I left that Easter convinced that something was wrong, he later recalled. That same afternoon, he encountered William Ellery Channing's Baltimore sermon, which introduced him to Unitarian thought and provided an intellectual foundation for his growing doubts about Trinitarian doctrine. For several years, Brown distanced himself from organized religion, but his mother eventually persuaded him to return as an organist for the Montego Bay Wesleyan Church. This period of religious engagement rekindled his appreciation for the fervor of Methodism, a sentiment that would stay with him throughout his life. However, by 1907, after losing his civil service position, Brown decided to enter the ministry, but he could not reconcile his beliefs with those of Methodism. All the doubts and questionings which had been lulled to rest were reawakened, he wrote. His early exposure to Unitarian thought resurfaced, leading him to seek ordination within that tradition. Determined to follow his convictions, Brown reached out to both the African Methodist Episcopal Church and any Unitarian minister he could find in New York. His letter was forwarded to President Southworth of Meadville Theological School, who welcomed his enrollment but warned that ministerial prospects for a Black Unitarian were uncertain. Undeterred, Brown responded, "I decided that if I did enter the ministry, it would have to be in the church in which I could be absolutely honest or in no church at all." His path to Meadville was fraught with obstacles. In 1908, he sailed to Baltimore, but was declared an illegal immigrant and deported. Facing religious and racial persecution in Jamaica, he made another attempt in 1909, only to have his father withdraw the promised financial support at the last minute. After persistent struggles, he finally enrolled at Meadville in the fall of 1910. On June 6, 1912, he was ordained and commissioned to return to Jamaica as a Unitarian missionary. He faced a number of struggles in that missionary work and ended up leaving his home for New York City, where he established the Harlem Unitarian Church in 1920. Brown's theological vision was rooted in a rational, ethical, and inclusive understanding of religion. In his sermon, Jesus Was a Unitarian, he argued that Jesus of Nazareth, the greatest religious teacher of all times, in his essential philosophy was a Unitarian. Rejecting Trinitarianism, he emphasized that Jesus never claimed divinity, but rather taught that God is a spirit, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Brown believed that Jesus preached salvation through character, not through atonement. Using a Unitarian phrase, he wrote, Jesus believed not in salvation by the atoning effects of the death of a Savior, but in salvation by character. Brown also championed the compatibility of religion and science. In his 1937 sermon, Religion in an Age of Science, Brown declared, "Science describes, religion interprets." He rejected the notion that faith and reason were in conflict, arguing instead, science and religion are complementary and both necessary in a fully orbed life. His church's constitution reflected this commitment, stating that its goal was to upbuild in the hearts of the people the high ideals of a rational, progressive, and exalting religion. In many ways, Brown's vision of religion was right in line with that of other religious humanists of the 1920s, including John Dietrich and Curtis W. Reese, all who emphasized confidence in the scientific method, faith in humankind, and a sense of reverence and awe about the universe. We can see that Ethelred Brown approached questions of religious freedom in a more indirect manner than Douglas or Maria Baldwin, both of whom participated in an organization explicitly devoted to that idea. For Brown, religious freedom was a highly personal question, especially when it came to his freedom to reject the Methodism of his youth and become a minister of an overwhelmingly white denomination. Religious freedom for him consisted in the ability to adhere to a religion where ethics was more important than metaphysics, and where religion was compatible with modern science, including Darwinian evolution. Another critical aspect of religious freedom for Brown was freedom of conscience and being able to debate ideas with those of other faiths or those of no faith at all. Instead of traditional services found in Baptist or AME congregations, the Harlem Unitarian Church often held forums on both religious and political topics, including such topics as secularism, Jesus and Marx, and the church and the Negro problem. Brown felt that Unitarianism was, quote, the religion of the future, the religion with an emancipatory message which all peoples of every race may understand and accept. Brown and most, if not all, of his parishioners felt that religion should be reasonable and should speak to the concerns of this world. For them, distinctions between the sacred and the secular were artificial, and it didn't matter so much what people believed as what they did. Brown often posited that religion is not confined within any walls or within any book. Indeed, for Brown, scientists, researchers, and doctors should be considered holy men and ministers, just as he himself was, because they labored tirelessly to discover nature's secrets. Brown also argued that men and women should not be forced to lay aside their reason to be Christians. He claimed that the Bible is merely, quote, a collection of documents according to the judgment of men, arbitrarily selected from a number of floating documents and put in a volume. Since this was the case, he argued that the Bible was not infallible. Unlike most freethinkers of his era, however, Brown was not an atheist or an agnostic, although he was a socialist, so politically radical. But his conception of God was expansive enough for him to allow, to welcome atheists and people of all faiths into his church. As he asked in one sermon, what of labels? Were we Mohammedans or Buddhists or Jews or atheists? All would be well if we lived the life of sacrificing service. Just as Ethelred Brown's ministry was winding down in Harlem, Louis McGee's was beginning in Chicago in the post-World War II era. McGee's interracial Unitarian congregation, the Free Religious Fellowship in Chicago, grew out of conversations between him, his wife Marcella McGee, and their friend Harry Jones at the Society for Ethical Culture in 1947. Aside from his sermons, we don't have much in the way of personal writings from McGee, but there is a brief 2-page statement entitled Why I Became a Unitarian that I came across while conducting research at Meadville Lumber Theological School in Chicago. In that document, McGee notes that while he was an AME minister in Cleveland during the 1920s, he worked for the post office, and while delivering mail one day, he came across an issue of the Unitarian periodical, The Christian Register. He began reading it, and he liked what it had to say. He then confessed what he did to the woman whose magazine it was, and she was very nice about it, saying he could read it and inviting him to her church. At his first service, Brown noted that there was a quiet dignity pervading the atmosphere. The hymns and readings were appealing. The sermon was inspiring. McGee would continue on in the AME ministry during the 1920s and 1930s, but he also identified as a religious humanist at the very time that this movement was taking off, especially in the Midwest where he lived. So he was an Army chaplain in World War I. He re-enlisted as an Army chaplain in World War II. And he came home, quote, with the conviction that if one could risk his life for his country, why not give life in service to one's ideals? I felt that my life would be less than lived, he posited, unless I had access to a free pulpit. McGee thus decided to pursue ordination as a Unitarian minister. During the week of April 26, 1946, he was interviewed for admission to Meadville Theological School by Dan Huntington Fenn, who noted that McGee was a man of apparently established and solid worth. I was very much attracted to him. He seemed to know precisely where he was and where he wanted to go. He also seemed to be a widely educated and thoroughly liberal personality. He gives the distinct impression of ability and stability. Fenn then went on to lay out the options for McGee as he saw them, which were to stay in the AME church and to suppress his beliefs, start a new liberal church among black people, join an established liberal church such as Ethelred Brown's, or to join a white congregation and make it interracial. McGee had already rejected the first point and eventually decided to start a new liberal church among black people after conducting a study among African Americans in Chicago. So in 1947, McGee, his wife Marcella, and their colleague Harry Jones began discussing the creation of a new religious institution on Chicago's South Side. Dissatisfied with the largely white composition of the Society for Ethical Culture, they envisioned a religious humanist congregation that would provide a community for African Americans who sought a faith rooted in reason, democracy, and social engagement. Their efforts culminated with the official launch of the Free Religious Fellowship on April 25, 1948, which emerged from what they had initially called the Free Religious Association, after the same organization that Frederick Douglass and Maria Baldwin had been a part of. McGee's Unitarianism was deeply influenced by religious humanism, which rejected supernaturalism in favor of reason, ethical action, and scientific inquiry. He defined religion as idealism in action under the guidance of intelligence using the tools of science. His humanist sermons often carried titles such as Have Faith in Man, We Choose Our Destiny, and a positive view of liberal religion. He championed Unitarianism's commitment to intellectual freedom, stating, "One can ask any and all questions, one can seek spiritual sustenance from any of the world's great religious or philosophical traditions." The four thinkers examined in this talk, Frederick Douglass, Maria Baldwin, Egbert Ethelred Brown, and Louis McGee, are some of the most important, but certainly not the only voices calling for religious freedom in African American culture during the 19th and 20th centuries. Historians have tended to focus on those more respectable advocates of religious freedom, those voices such as Richard Allen, Jarena Lee, or Christopher Rush, voices who argued for religious freedom on the grounds that societal factors were inhibiting them from being good evangelical Protestant Christians. Their work was challenging, but they also had a leg up because they were basically arguing for the right to have similar religious experiences and institutions as the majority of white Christians. Their arguments were more ones of assimilation to American values and American culture. And there were ones that gained them respectable white allies, such as Benjamin Rush, for example, signer of the Declaration of Independence and an early and strong supporter of Richard Allen's Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia during the 1790s. But secularists and religious liberals had a much more challenging time of it because they were arguing for a type of religious freedom that was much less respectable, namely freedom from traditional Protestant theologies and institutions, or even freedom from any religion whatsoever. Already stigmatized by their race, black religious liberals and secular thinkers took on the further stigma of radical religion and irreligion. They did so because they felt it was important to live a life of conscience and integrity. And for them, that meant being true to their theological beliefs or lack thereof. But they also embraced the stigma of radical religion because they believed strongly in the ideals of religious freedom as beneficial in themselves. For them, religious freedom was not just about where or how one worshiped, it was also intimately tied to freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. In fighting for religious freedom then, Black secular thinkers and religious liberals were fighting for what they saw as core American values, values that could effectively undermine American racism and promote a healthy and flourishing democracy. Thank you very much.
I'll start off with one of the electronic questions that's come in. So, why do oppressed people like the Black slaves and indigenous people of Latin America adopt their oppressors' religions?
Yeah, so this is actually something I explored in my first book, which was the complete opposite of my book, Black Freethinkers, on kind of atheists and agnostics. In my first book, I actually looked at the rise of Black Puritans in colonial and revolutionary era Massachusetts, and the ties between Black religious thought and politics. And so one of the things that I saw in doing research on kind of Black Puritan thinkers was that oftentimes this was a very useful strategy for them politically, right? Using a certain type of theological language, attending particular churches, right? Being very visible in spaces that were important to Massachusetts's religious and political authorities. That gained them a level of respectability, and it allowed them to kind of further their political goals of ending both slavery and the slave trade in Massachusetts. So it's not to say that that's the only reason that African Americans, for example, became Christians, but that it is one kind of powerful justification, right, or one powerful reason for that. But also, some simply believed in Christian theology, and they found ways to sort of meld Christian doctrines and rituals with traditional African religions, right? So Mikhail Sobel, for example, in the late 70s, wrote books on the African Baptist tradition in revolutionary America, noting that much of early Baptist theology and practice accorded very well with like water rituals in African traditional religions, for example. So there's oftentimes kind of opportunities in Christianity for enslaved people and for free Black people to sort of meld their traditional beliefs with this new religion they're encountering. So I think it's partly a firm and sincere belief in Christian theology. And for those who it's not, it's a very practical tool in the Black freedom struggle.
Okay, how widespread was the freedom thinking view amongst African American communities? There's another part, the magnitude of impact, and the last I can't read, so we'll go with those two.
Yeah, sure. So Black freethinkers, atheists, agnostics, Black religious liberals were always a very small part of the Black population, although their numbers have basically tripled over the past 30 years or so. So they're growing more recently. But in early America, for example, they were a very small part, and even throughout much of the 20th century. Nonetheless, they were a very significant part because they were sort of overrepresented in the population of Black intellectuals, Black writers, artists, thinkers. So if we look at the Harlem Renaissance, for example, and just any of the major writers of the Harlem Renaissance that you can think of, they were probably an atheist or an agnostic, right? And you oftentimes aren't introduced to those, like that aspect of their work. So for example, when I was going through school, we all had to read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. We never read her autobiography where she talks about the fact that she's sort of a deist and an agnostic, right? Where she talks about not believing in prayer, how only weak people need to pray, and the strong don't really need that, and how she critiques like the origins of Christianity. We didn't read that, but we read Their Eyes Are Watching God, right? So when we look at like the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Claude McKay, I mean, the list goes on of really prominent and influential black thinkers and activists who embrace some form of free thought or religious liberalism. So very small but very influential population.
What religious homes do black liberals and secularists have today?
So there aren't a whole lot. One is the Baha'i faith, which is kind of open to people of all different faith perspectives, right? Another, probably the most prominent one is the Unitarian Universalist churches, right? Where black religious liberals have been attending since the start, right? Since the founding of the first Universalist church in the United States in the 1770s. Gloucester Dalton was one of the founding members of that church in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I'm writing about that in my current book project. And black atheists also feel pretty comfortable attending Unitarian Universalist churches today because oftentimes the ministers are atheists or agnostics. And like, those in the Free Religious Association, which was sort of an offshoot of Unitarianism, or the Society for Ethical Culture, Unitarian Universalists often emphasize more ethics and morality as opposed to you have to believe a certain thing, right? So that's something where, for my case, I'm a secular humanist and an atheist, but I pretty regularly attend a Unitarian Universalist church because I really admire their social justice commitments. My wife is she's a Christian and she's very spiritual, and she also attends a Unitarian Universalist church for the same exact reasons, right? So we're kind of both de-emphasizing the theology in favor of the praxis, and so that's a space where I think a lot of black religious liberals and secularists feel comfortable. But we're also carving out some of our own spaces. So in 2015, a new organization called Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism was founded by some Black Lives Matter activists who are attending a gathering in Cleveland. Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism has worked closely with the Unitarian Universalist Association, but it's also now incorporated as its own church, right? So it has spaces within UU churches, but may at some point even create some of its own congregations.
Do you observe parallels in what could be interpreted as a moving away from traditional Holy Trinity and conservative theology and an embracing of freedom thinking views in our current social and theological climate?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially one of the more prominent religious developments I think we're seeing is a kind of returning of African Americans to traditional African religions, right? And sort of like, in the Caribbean, voodoo, obeah, things like that. Or even going back and embracing African traditions as well. So that's a kind of really significant development that's sort of pushing back against what they see as a real conservatism and sometimes unwillingness to change in the kind of mainline black churches.
What can we imply from these thinkers as we struggle today with a call to more inclusive practice, anti-racism, etc.?
Well, I think for, one of the distinctive things about black liberal and black secular thought is its strong commitment to social justice and to the Black freedom struggle, but also to really promoting American democracy, right? And this is something that really distinguishes Black secularism, for example, from the white secular tradition, which at many times has simply been concerned with issues of religious freedom, separation of church and state, the teaching of evolution in public schools, but not so much of promoting justice and equality for all, right? Black secular thinkers have never had that ability to kind of ignore those kind of racial and political issues in the United States. So that's a kind of distinctive aspect of that movement.
Are these churches, I think this is these churches, longevities? Not sure of that. Let's go to another one. Let me figure that one out. Okay. Are these congregations still in existence that have evolved from those four that are discussed?
Yeah, so many of the congregations that they attended are still in existence. So some of the Unitarian and Universalist churches. The Free Religious Association died out in the early 20th century. Again, Louis McGee's Free Religious Fellowship was something of an attempt to kind of build on the legacy of that Free Religious Association. And if I'm not mistaken, the Free Religious Fellowship is still meeting in Chicago to this day, like a very small but committed band of Black Unitarians in Chicago are still meeting kind of under that name. The Harlem Unitarian Church, unfortunately, that passed away, that kind of died when Ethelred Brown passed away in 1956.
What leaders do you see leading the future with these same ideas of these four Black African American freethinkers?
Leslie Mack, I would say, is one. Lena Gardner is another. These are two of the principal founders of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. Michael Slack is the community minister for Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. So these are some of the main people that are kind of carrying on this long historical tradition of Black Unitarians. In the 1960s, there was actually a similar movement to what we see going on today. In 1966, the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus was founded. It was one of 10 Black caucuses in mainline Protestant denominations that aimed to kind of combine, for the Black UU Caucus, it aimed to combine the political principles of the Black Power movement with the theology of Unitarian Universalism. And today, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism is engaged in a very similar type of project, right? Combining some of the political ideologies of the Black Lives Matter movement with Unitarian Universalist theology. So I'd say those are kind of some of the leading ones. And Leslie Mack also, in addition to being one of the founders of Blue, as they call it, was also one of the trustees. She was elected as a trustee of the Unitarian Universalist Association maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
What was the response of the Black faith communities to these four liberal leaders?
So oftentimes one of strong opposition, especially in the case of Douglas, right, who was probably much more vocal in his critiques of the Black church than some of the other ones. Sometimes it was simply sort of ignoring or not extending some of the kind of common professional courtesies that ministers had, like swapping pulpits, right? You're a minister in the early 20th century, throughout the 19th century, a common practice was swapping pulpits with other ministers so that you didn't have to write a brand new sermon every single Sunday, right? It's a way of kind of lightening your workload and that of your colleagues. But for folks like Ethelred Brown, a lot of the ministers would refuse to swap pulpits with him because they didn't want Brown coming in and preaching these heresies about, a kind and loving God who wants everybody to be saved to their parishioners, right? So that made his life kind of a little more challenging, a little more difficult. And for those who were kind of completely secular, not just religious liberal, the opposition was kind of much more harsh and vocal. Nonetheless, though, we do see, even though mainline black ministers were strongly opposed to atheists and agnostics, we do nonetheless see black secular thinkers influencing important trends in African American religion. And one of these is the rise of the black theology of liberation in the 1960s. So for, probably 70 or 80 years, black secularists and religious liberals had been hammering away at traditional evangelical churches for being too otherworldly, right? And finally, in the 1960s, some of these black churches were kind of responding to these long-standing critiques and explicitly formulating a theology that was about bringing about racial and social justice in this world and wasn't so heavily focused on salvation in the next.
Are there prominent African American secularists or religious free thinkers active? I think we did that one. Hang on. Let's get rid of that. Why do oppressed people, well, they rewrote that one too. Hang on, let's find one we haven't done. How did your activists feel about Thomas Jefferson?
Yeah.
Salute of religious freedom, they also wrote here, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Of the four that I talked about, only Douglas really said anything about Thomas Jefferson, and he widely reviled and denounced him as a hypocrite. He liked Jefferson's ideas as articulated in the Declaration, but certainly not the man himself. But nonetheless, oddly enough, all of them were following in something of a Jeffersonian tradition in trying to promote the separation of church and state, right? So even though they didn't necessarily like him or agree with him, I think they're still part of this kind of American tradition of trying to promote democracy by keeping faith and religion as separate as possible.
Hang on, stay here. Is there a presence in human societies?
Humanist.
Oh, humanist, sorry about that. Humanist society is a little like, go ahead.
Is it a presence in?
Is there a presence in humanist society?
Oh, like a black presence? Yeah, absolutely. Yep. In fact, the current president of the American Humanist Association is a black woman, right? And yeah, like I said, the number of black secularists, those identifying as atheist agnostic, has basically tripled over the past 30 years. So we're seeing a lot higher numbers and very high engagement in both some of the kind of historically white organizations like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, so they're becoming increasingly prominent in these organizations, but also founding some of their own, like Black Non-Believers Incorporated, which was founded by Mandisa Thomas, black woman secular thinker, in 2011, and now has chapters in, I think, 8 or 9 different cities throughout the country. I actually serve as the vice president of the board for that organization.
Okay. Okay, it is dead. Did you run into stories about Nathaniel Toplift Allen, a white guy, in Boston? He started a diverse school in West Newton, Massachusetts in 1850s.
I have not, no. But whoever asked that, I'd be happy to hear more. I'd love to hear some more.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll hang on to this, and hopefully whoever wrote this, if they're here, come up and speak to them afterwards. Last one. This is a little tough too, because I'm not sure where they're going. What to be done, re-powerful political figures? I'm sorry. Like the governor, well, we got that. But what's the question? The question's not clear. What is to be done? Is that supposed to be regarding powerful I think is regarding powerful political figures, like the governor of Florida. She mentions Trump and a few other things.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I mean, I think we can take the sort of example of these really important and prominent black religious liberals who fought for religious freedom, who fought for freedom of conscience, who fought for freedom of speech. Someone like Ethelred Brown, who came here, who was deported, who was facing so much opposition in Jamaica, a very religiously conservative nation, but persisted there for 7 or 8 years before coming to Harlem. Persisted in his church in Harlem for 36 years with very little support from the American Unitarian Association, because he believed very strongly in this sort of rational and progressive religion, and he believed very strongly in kind of interfaith cooperation, in freedom of conscience, and in freedom of speech. So I think it's really just continuing on in their legacy, sort of building off of their efforts, and continuing to try to fight for democratic values.
And that's the
Thank you
last
very
of the
much.
questions.